Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual edition of We Robot 2020, the premier international conference on law and policy relating to robotics, hosted this year by the University of Ottawa Centre for Law, Technology and Society. We reinvented We Robot in the time of COVID-19, and We Robot 2020 is presented with the generous support of Microsoft, CIFAR, X, and Intel, as well as the University of Ottawa, the University of Washington Technology Policy Lab, and Miami Law. For those who are not familiar with the We Robot format, please note that the authors do not present their own work. Instead, session discussants read the author's papers in advance of the conference and present the author's work to the audience, while offering constructive thoughts for improvement and seeding the conversation that follows. Authors then have 5 minutes to respond to discussants' feedback. Then the session usually opens to the floor. For the virtual edition, we invite the audience to engage with the papers in the comments section below the video. For this session, we are delighted to welcome as discussant Aushande Oshaba, an information scientist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Purdue RAND Graduate School, to present two papers. First, a paper by Emily McBain-Ashfield from the University of Ottawa and from Jason Miller, also from the University of Ottawa, titled Off-the-Shelf Sentiment Analysis, the Policy Problem of Subjectively Annotated Data for Objectively Measured Models. And a second paper by Luke Stark from Western University and G.C. Hoey from University of Waterloo, titled The Ethics of Emotion in AI Systems. And without further ado, I will hand it over to our discussant to start the conversation. Thank you.
All right, let's dig right into it. So these two papers were really interesting. I don't often get to think very carefully about the role of emotions in computing artificial intelligence. And so these two sort of helped us think through how they are currently implemented, how they currently work, and also think through the ethics and the policies that should scaffold their use in general life. So we have two papers essentially dissecting how emotions in artificial intelligence influence our lives and how, especially as our lives are represented in digital spaces. In a sense, they come at the question of emotional AI from two different directions. Emily and Jason's paper sort of starts with the conversation on sentiment analysis, and Luke's paper sort of gets at it from the perspective of what theories of behavior and emotion actually underpin many of the models we see being developed. So to start with Emily and Jason's paper, the title being Off-the-Shelf Sentiment Analysis and the ethics of subjectively annotated data. There is a recurring theme in my read of the paper was this use of the term subjective and objective. I have some concerns with the way those terms are used, but I think this is really just a matter of terminology. In digging into the details of the paper, so the paper starts by laying out the details of the construction of sentiment analysis models. So sentiment analysis models, they look at our digital exhaust in the form of natural language utterances on the web, on online platforms, and they try to learn, or they try to tag all our language use with sentiment tags. So for example, you write something and maybe you write it in all caps or write it with lots of exclamation signs, and maybe it says model flags that as being potentially aggressive. We are seeing things like this being used on platforms to vet. For example, they use the example of vetting a babysitter to make sure that they are not aggressive, or that they are suitable for bringing into your own home. And so this begins to highlight a theme in which the use of these types of tools for essentially vetting digital exhausts for sentiment and emotions are actually influencing decisions in day-to-day lives. and the quality of those decisions are subject to concern, and the quality of those decisions also actually lead to the control and increasingly higher and higher priority aspect of our lives. So as they walk through the construction of sentiment analysis models, they begin to dig a little bit more into the nature of the ML models, the statistical models used for this work, and they rely on a couple of documents or reports on this to inform the analysis. The focus on the models used, the machine learning models used, helps them scope helps them scope where they want to focus on. I think in this conversation they're focusing mostly on a part of the ML development process that we don't tend to focus on in discussions as much. This is the issue of the annotation process, because they're using, most of these models use statistical machine learning models, essentially supervised models, to help them learn to tag text for sentiment. The requirement for this is labeled data. And so much of the discussion focuses on the annotation process, the labeling process for these emotional tags, for these sentiment tags. And so the motivation for this includes, well, if you're going to be using this, we want to make sure that the data on which the models are trained are a good reflection of the ground truth of sentiment in language use on the web. And if they're going to be using these types of sentiment analysis models to inform high impact decision making, that makes it doubly important that they actually are accurate. So the focus on annotation is interesting, and from my perspective, it's really important for this particular application. A lot of the discussion on fairness in machine learning, on fairness in modeling, or ethics in artificial intelligence sort of takes the data as given and starts thinking about the ethical perspective only after we have the data as a given. They give the example of the Jigsaw project, where they sort of create, and in a sense, I've actually used this data for projects in my personal work life. They sort of have this nice data set for toxic label classification. And for most machine learning practitioners, there is just an assumption that Jigsaw knows what they're doing. They have the expertise to actually do this type of labeling, and it's just a matter of building the right unbiased models, unbiased after the fact of the data annotation, the right unbiased models of sentiment and toxicity. And here, Emily and Jason are flipping that paradigm on its head and saying, no, let's not just assume that we can assure fairness after the data is present. Let's think a bit more carefully about the process of generating those data sets. And I think that is a line of reasoning that is going to become increasingly more and more important as we start digging more carefully into the systemic nature of bias in artificial intelligence. So they dig into a couple of ways in which subjectivity of the annotation process can lead to subjective models, and they sort of start thinking through approaches for making that subjectivity less pernicious. And they use a couple of examples specifically from the psychiatric practice literature, or psychiatric practices, to sort of guide them in thinking through how to make that annotation process a bit more objective. Now, this is where the issue I had with, well, it's not an issue, it's just it's a concern. This is where the concern I have on the question of subjectivity versus objectivity sort of begins to rear its head. I wonder if the authors are comfortable calling the use of, say, the Diagnostic Standards Manual, DSM-5, the use of the guidelines stated therein. I wonder if they are comfortable calling that an objective practice as opposed to just a very consistent practice. Like there is value in consistency. Like we want, like as the authors describe in their work, they talk through how having a consistent practice makes people more confident that they are working with the rule of law as opposed to the rule of man. That's great, but consistency is not the same thing as objectivity, and I would appreciate it if they spend more time thinking through how those concepts work together. And the other aspect here, so they use these psychiatric guidelines as a precedent for how we might try to make the process of annotating data for training sentiment analysis models more consistent, more objective. And I think at first when I was reading that section, I had misgivings, not just because of the issue of objectivity versus subjectivity, but also because the DSM is imperfect. But over time, in the discussion of the DSM as a guideline, as a precedent for this type of work, they highlight that it's not the guidelines in the DSM-5 that they really think are important. It's the process of generating those guidelines that's really important. So if we take the scientific innovation paradigm, we may not have objective truth about the sentiment in a language corpus, but if we have a standard rigorous process for trying to learn to improve our procedures to get closer and closer to objective truth, then we have some confidence to proceed on. The other so they use, I really like that discussion because it goes away from an assertion that we have an objective way of doing this to a suggestion that we should think through instituting processes for making this annotation process more consistent. And then they besides the DSM precedent, they talk a little bit about standardized testing, the historical comparison with standardized testing. And I think this is a very salient comparison, because what happens here is you have a set of test makers trying to figure out how to tag some factor in a population, and they come up with tests to try to do that. In this case, intelligence or aptitude or whatever it is, they come up with tests to try to do that. But historically, we've seen that the construction of the test is very culturally aware, in the sense that it often targets a very specific audience, and when it's applied to a different audience, it doesn't have the same type of power, the same type of prediction quality. And so here they use that analogy to talk about the annotation process. Oftentimes you have annotators trying to tag a factor in a language corpus, in a population's use of language, and the cultural context of those language use cases are going to be different, and that can affect the quality of the annotation practice. I think there's actually a lot more they could do to explore that angle, because if you take the analogy with the test making a bit deeper, it's sort of, you have one population trying to do it for an entire population, for an entire background population. It'd be useful if the author spent some time thinking about the different populations of annotators and the different cultural context in which the annotated data will be applied to. So I'm thinking, for example, there is a precedent in machine learning modeling where you label data using mechanical Turkers, who are often going to be outside the country, and so they are applying their cultural understanding of sentiment to the labeling task that they're trying to achieve. So I love this paper. It's awesome. The other perspective, the last thing I'll try to bring up here is, two things I'll try to bring up here. Let me finish the summary of the paper. The last section in the paper talks about policy considerations, and they underpin that conversation by exploring the use of sentiment analysis in employment practices and in mental health. And I think those two case studies, if we'll call it that, are really interesting because they highlight a very key aspect of the work that Emily and Jason are doing. Historically, when people have talked about sentiment analysis, especially in marketing, it has been the use of sentiment analysis engines to try to understand aggregate sentiment. And so they have a nice statement, a nice discussion in which they identify a switch in that paradigm, in which instead of trying to use these models to approximate average sentiment, people, companies, commercial entities are using these models to try to pinpoint individual sentiment and act on the basis of that. I think that's a very, very strong point that needs to be emphasized. And it needs to be emphasized for a couple of reasons. My last point in this whole conversation will be on the statistical theories underpinning that. So the case studies on employment and mental health highlight that switch very strongly. The only thing I would say on the policy considerations would be, as you're thinking about next steps and best practices, and some of the best practices you guys identify are consistent with a lot of the stuff going on in the field of bias and equity in algorithms. So, for example, you say you should label the annotated data for both for accuracy and to give people a sense of the subjectivity in the data annotation process. That's consistent with, for example, Tim Gabriel's paper on data sheets for data sets, where it's not just a matter of, but you guys are going further than that, saying you can't just characterize the conditions of collection of the data set, but you have to also have an additional label in that data sheet that identifies the issue of subjectivity in the annotation process. Because as you guys argue, and I think I would agree, but I think you probably need more support for this point. You argue that the use of machine learning models for targets and objective measures is likely more accurate, even if it's not perfect, more accurate than the use of machine learning models for targeting subjective factors like sentiment. So I think that makes perfect sense. Having a data sheet that has an extra label for subjectivity is awesome. But I also think that you probably might want to think a bit more carefully about the process for the execution process for any policies that you specify. When you talk about creating, I'm using this metaphor, it's not exactly what you say. When you talk about creating data sheets for annotated data sets, we need to think very carefully about who will be creating those data sheets, who will be creating those standards that would apply across the board, and who would by what process would we enforce the creation or the widespread use of data sheets? Is it going to be just something that we would hope will evolve naturally by self-organization in the industry? I can see arguments for that, but I don't think it's a foolproof plan, because it's hard to get compliance in such a diverse group of actors. So would you say, okay, for a prioritized set of sentiment analysis use cases, we would have acquisition requirements that if you're going to provide models that do sentiment analysis in employment, in mental health, and whatever, then we have these very strong requirements in the acquisition process that asks you to be more careful with your annotation processes. Yeah, thinking through how execution enforcement of policies would work would be super, super important for, I think, making your paper really impactful. The last thing I will sort of highlight, and it's sort of a question, but also sort of coming from the statistical machine learning perspective, there is a question here when you talk about subjectivity of the annotation process, whether you mean that the signals. So the three meanings you could pull out from that statement of subjectivity are the labels systematically biased, and you don't make an argument for that one way or the other. The second issue is, are the labels not necessarily biased, but do they have high variance? Like, is it a situation that there is a lot of variability in the accuracy of the annotations? If that's the case, then it's not necessarily a bad thing, because with enough data, you could average out that data and average out that noise and still get useful sentiment analysis. The third one, I think, is the worst case scenario. When you say subjective, do you mean that there is no information content in the annotation for the underlying ground truth of sentiment? So I guess the key point I'm trying to make is there needs to be a bit more discussion, a bit more analysis of what you mean by subjectivity in your annotation process. Is it lack of information about what it's trying to actually measure, just high variability, or is it truly just very biased and subject to cultural, varying biased based on the cultural context of language use? I don't have a sense that you guys have done that here, and I think to make this paper really impactful, that question needs to be nailed down a little bit more. That was a bit rambly. I love the paper. I look forward to seeing what you guys do with it. I'm gonna stop there, and I'll take Luke's on the second half.
I think why don't we do Luke's commentary now, and then we'll move on to a general kind of response and then discussion. Is that okay if we proceed that way? Perfect. Okay.
Okay. So Luke's paper is really interesting because I have some forays into this, and I sort of threw up my hands in exasperation when I tried to do this for a project. And so seeing somebody trying to create a more theoretically principled walk through the field is really nice and really important. So let's see. Okay. So the paper is essentially on the ethics of emotion in artificial intelligence systems, and the key themes I drew from this paper were the trend on digital phenotyping, essentially using a digital exhaust to get to classify cluster people into different categories that might represent emotions. Then the other themes were a nice layout of the theories of emotion and affect, and how those theories of emotion and affect underpin, whether explicitly or implicitly, the machine learning or artificial intelligence models that companies are building all over the place. And I particularly enjoy the paper over-indexes on basic emotion theory, but I particularly enjoy that because I watched Lie to Me quite a lot, and so Paul Ekman's work is well represented in there. Let me try to be more structured here. So the paper takes a step back from the computer science implementations of emotional artificial intelligence and tries to, first of all, lay out the theories that underpin these artifacts, and because these theories essentially they determine to some extent the validity of the implementations. If the theories are not predictively valid, then the models, the artifacts based on them, become more suspect. And so the paper takes that step back, focuses on the theories, walks through the history of the literature of emotions, of the science of emotions and behaviors and affect, and it walks through theories. I particularly enjoy James Lange's hypothesis, which makes zero sense to me, but it's interesting. And focuses largely on Ekman's basic emotion theory because it seems to be the paper argues that is the theory that many AI models sort of over-index on. So this is it's really interesting that it do this, that the paper does this, and I like the next step the paper takes. The paper uses those theories of emotion to try to underpin the types of data that any model of emotion would need to have to actually implement what the theory of emotion is saying. And then they use that to lay out a taxonomy, essentially, of matching theories of emotion with models, AI models, emotional AI models that you might want to build. Then the second part of the paper takes that very strong introduction to the intersection of emotional theory and artificial intelligence, and tries to come up with an analysis of how these theories intersect with the ethics of creating artificial intelligence models for emotions. And so it discusses things like the fact that we don't really have a clear sense of how much normative weight we put on how emotions affect decision making. And that's a very strong point. I would love to see that point expanded on a lot more. I think the one that really struck a chord with me based on my prior project experience is the lack of a consensus of a true is the wrong term to use here. The lack of a consensus on the best model of emotions. And so if there is no consensus, it's sort of suggesting that there's still a lot of uncertainty about how people actually process and experience emotions. And so creating models on that morass of theories on emotions suggests that many models will be sometimes wrong, at worst misguided, and maybe a very small subset of models would actually correctly model how emotions are felt in practice. And the other part, so that was the one that struck a chord for me, because in trying to build models of emotional artificial intelligence, the absence, even after consulting with lots of behavioral scientists, the absence of a consensus on the theory hampers any type of model building effort. The other part, I think, that's more important, the other piece of analysis I think is actually more important for policymaking, is this angle that Luke and Jesse highlight, the fact that by having these AI models of emotion out in the wild in commercial products, we're essentially sanctioning, not that we allow it, we're essentially sanctioning the unregulated experimentation on humans, on the emotional processes, and we're doing it without oversight, without any type of control. Now, this is important because it allows commercial platforms to influence large populations at massive scales in ways that the populations may not be aware of, and without any oversight on the ethics guiding these types of experimentation. So that point, I think is super important from a policy and politics perspective. It's also a point that's hard to argue clearly in a way that drives policy action, because it's not, as we said, the consensus on the theories of emotion are not as clear-cut as we would like. And so trying to convince a policymaker that this is going on without that clear consensus is sort of difficult. But yeah, it's a wonderful paper. There are parts, I think the descriptive part of it, the laying out of the theories, matching up with the models of artificial intelligence, that stuff is the most powerful part of the paper. The analysis brings up a lot of interesting points, some of which I really agree with and I think are important, but I think they need to be fleshed out in a more impactful way. And I guess the question I would be interested in hearing responses to is in the for lack of a better term, in the harder sciences, the quality of a theory is anchored on, not always, but a strong part of the power of a theory is anchored on its predictive value. And I'm wondering if there is any discussion the author can make on which of these theories of emotion have precedent in the literature showing that they have more predictive value than the other. Now, I know that's a really contentious question to ask in the social scientific setting, because oftentimes theories are more like hypotheses of how things actually work, as opposed to theories of explaining what happens causally. But if you're going to be thinking about true models of emotions, from a implementation perspective, most of machine learning anchors on this aspect of predictive value. How much power does this wonderful theory of whatever actually give us for predicting some observable out in the world? And I would also, it'd be nice also, so that's my primary thing. I know it's a question that maybe might not be answerable, but I would love to see an addressing of that. The other thing I would like to see more of, and I think the authors do a little bit of this in the paper, but I hope that they will do a lot more of this. There is a lot of discussion on the cultural subjectivity of how emotions are experienced, and I want to see I hope other people reading the paper would also be very interested in seeing how that cultural subjectivity interacts with the use of emotional AI out in the field. Does that mean that the emotional AI models we see being developed are less useful for entire subpopulations? If so, how do we navigate that subjectivity? Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the paper. I'd love to see the analysis section be a lot more detailed, a lot stronger. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So first off, thank you so much for all those comments. I'm sorry if I wasn't looking up the whole time. I was like very rigorously trying to jot down everything, and then I remembered halfway through this is recorded. So I guess like the main, point that I want to address, and thank you for bringing up, is I do think that we need to think more about defining what we're talking about when we talk about subjectively annotating the data, because you are right that we don't, I don't think we do that clearly enough, and I think that is a conversation that Jason and I need to have and think through more. And I think also we're, as Jason mentioned, and as is mentioned in the paper, we're doing interviews with people who are actually doing this work. And through those interviews, we're starting to see more and more some of the issues in terms of, like you even brought up, Ashante, in your comments about, you know, in terms of when data is being, or the annotations being crowdsourced, like we're asking, like, so do you know where these people are that are crowdsourced, that are actually annotating the data? And I think that is an interesting question that needs to be asked and can impact the, I guess, our understanding of what we mean by subjectivity and how that can, how that actually plays out in terms of what the data looks like in the end. Another question I wanted to, or not question, comment I wanted to address was the our description of the DSM as an analogy. And I think that you're right that we need to be a bit clearer that we are not saying that the DSM is objective, because I don't think it is, and I don't think that I think that's pretty like uncontroversial to say, but more looking at it as a model and a process that we're using to help guide our understanding and our conversations about how we can better create these categories of sentiment in terms of classification process and annotating the data. And also, like you mentioned, more of just a consistent practice. So like one thing that we mentioned in the paper, but maybe we need to stress more, is talking about the long history and process that has gone into the DSM, and also the continued debate. So that's one thing that we highlight, is how even with the most recent version, the DSM-5, there's been some pretty harsh criticism of some of the choices that were made. And so what we are more hoping to see is like that kind of discussion and debate over what goes into annotating data. And I also appreciated one thing I think I want to talk to Jason about and implement further in the paper, is maybe delving more into the standardized testing analogy, because I think you're right. And it's also something that I've had in conversations, like you mentioned, you try to describe to someone who doesn't know anything about sentiment analysis or this type of machine learning. And I find that often standardized testing is like a very easy comparison for people to understand what we're getting at in terms of like comparing the annotator to the test maker and those cultural differences and how they can shape the outcome at that very beginning stage. Jason, do you want to add any comments?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just Oshande, thank you so much for like what was I thought just totally what I was expecting when I saw that you were going to be helping out with these this discussant role. Just a really thoughtful and deep and helpful commentary on a work that we've been thinking about for a while now. This all started, I suppose, when we started thinking about the practices among data scientists, AI researchers when running these competitions. So when I first heard about these competitions that get run, I thought, ooh, this is like the STS side of my brain lit up. I'm like, oh, cultural practices around some sort of AI. I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about this. The competitions fascinate me, and I think Emily, as we started getting into these discussions around these competitions, it's just fascinating to think how there's this interesting thing that happens when you move from in order to interpret what people are claiming about models, which tends to be these quantitative measures that get put out there, right? Like this model is 72% accurate or 82% accurate at detecting whatever. We started questioning, like, what does that mean? What goes into making that number? Like, what's the meaning behind that number? And so we started uncovering all these really interesting data annotation issues, questions around like who's doing the annotation, how does the annotation fit into people's incentives around these competitions? So for the fact that, in the competition, for somebody running the competition, the focus here is really getting a bunch of models and having some way of measuring them relative to one another. And that's something that does not get talked about a lot, I don't think, in the literature. So, and that's kind of what led us to this understanding of the annotation, like what's going on in this business of annotation. And of course, as you point out, Oshande, when you're annotating a data set for, say, stop signs versus speed limit signs on the road, these are relatively objective things that you can point to and say, like, yeah, you're not going to get a lot of disagreement on what is a stop sign. And sure, there are going to be cultural differences in what's a stop sign. Sometimes they're kind of this shape, sometimes they're that shape. The language is going to change a little bit. Maybe the color changes a little bit. But at least locally, you can lock down, I guess, pretty objectively what those things are. And we just found that with sentiment analysis, none of those rules seem to hold. Like it just opens up a whole other, adapting or applying those same practices that go on in competitions around identifying stop signs to a problem of identifying aggression or depression in text seem like just qualitatively different practices. So we wanted to unpack that a bit. So anyway, that's kind of what's behind all of this. So I just want to thank you. The guidance, so the policy bit, Emily and I were kind of like, yeah, I don't know what to do with this policy piece. Like, how do we want to approach this? Do we get into the policy recommendations? How deep do we get into this? Your suggestions are very helpful. So, I thank you for writing that part of the paper for us. We'll definitely mention you in the acknowledgements. No, but thank you. That's really thoughtful. And I really appreciate the clarity on the three. Where do I have it in my notes here? Again, like Emily, I realized partway through that it was being recorded, which is just great. We can refer back to this as like a how-to guide to improve the paper. It sounds like you've offered sort of three ways to think about subjectivity, which I think is fantastic. So that recommendation alone, is just worth its weight in gold. So thank you for the commentary, and I think that's really all I have to say. And we'll turn the paper over to Luke's paper, which is also fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after this.
Sure. Yeah, and I just want to echo both Emily and Jason, Oshande, thank you so much for fantastic commentary and fantastic advice and comments. It's really valuable, and I really appreciate it. As does Jesse, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. Yeah, your suggestions for, and I was also taking notes, looking down. Your suggestions are spot on. I think as we work this paper towards the submission deadline. It seems like an eon ago in whenever it was in early in the year. I think your points that the analysis sections could be more fleshed out are good ones, and I think we are going to do that. And I, as with your point about the cultural subjectivity of emotion, which is something we don't talk a lot about. I mean, this is just one of the ways that emotion is so interesting and so sticky. It's just that's one of the cultural subjectivity of emotional expression and emotional norms is just one of the vectors whereby you get this kind of variation and this lack of necessary consistency that something like the BET model, the basic emotion theory model, tries to solve. Right? And I think this is why this is so appealing to computer scientists. It gives this kind of narrative about why and how emotions work around the world objectively, despite the fact that there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of evidence that it's not particularly well grounded in core concepts. To your question about the predictive value of theories of emotion, I mean, I think it's interesting. So Jesse Hui, who my co-author, is a computer scientist who has been working for now many years with a set of theories that I mentioned in the paper that we mentioned in the paper called affect control theory, which is this very interesting kind of alternate paradigm for thinking about affect and emotion. It comes out of sociology. It has its own really interesting history. And it essentially tries to quantify social relationships to predict the kind of typical behavior or typical emotional response in a particular situation. And you can imagine there are a lot of problems with this. And as somebody from a kind of critical humanities tradition, the idea of reifying the kind of most typical traditions in the society really gives me a lot of pause. But it does have this for typical situations. Again, it does have this kind of ability to say, okay, if in most North American cultures, if you see a nursing mother in a park, generally that's going to cause on various vectors of affect a positive response. Versus something else that might provoke a negative response. So I think in some ways, I think more of it as a question of typicality versus edge cases around these questions of predictive value. And I think that is also what makes emotion so difficult, because it as your point about the shift from aggregate to individual analysis around set analysis, which I think is a fantastic point in Emily and Jason's paper, right? The aggregate analysis is one thing, and you can sort of say, okay, that's kind of fun, it's interesting. You can put the aggregate mood of Twitter on, up on a some sort of screen. But the kind of range of variation is so important in individual responses that if you start getting decisions being made on those assessments of individual response, you risk a lot of problems. And I think that goes back to this point about the normative weight we put on emotional cues, which is something that I want to draw out in the paper, as you suggest. I really look forward to citing Emily and Jason, your paper. I have a piece from 2018 that talks a little bit more about different data sources for emotive expression and emotional expression. So we didn't cover that as much in this paper. This paper was more about the sort of the models that behind those sources. But I do think that it, there are these interesting interactions, and I think all of the kind of challenges around sentiment analysis and it's the data that it produces and the kind of dictionary, the dictionaries that get put forward first of all as the kind of source for the analysis and the annotation are all it's all big pitfalls. I tend to feel like a lot of these systems are sort of like onions or Russian nesting dolls. You peel back one layer of bias or problematic processes, and then you find another layer and you find another layer. And the question is if there's anything at in the center when you've peeled back all the layers. So thank you for that so much. I really appreciate it.
I have a question for Luke, so I just want to jump in and start a conversation here. So, well, first of all, I loved the paper. I thought it was just this systematic approach to breaking down models of emotion and then tying it to the analysis. I thought it was just it was such a great start, like way to anchor the analysis. What I did want, I got so excited, and then I got to the analysis, and I think I was wanting more because there was just so much in the use of the models and the way that you describe the models and set up the analysis. One of the things, but so I absolutely loved it, and like you, I felt like as I was reading through the paper, Emily, I don't know if you had this reaction. I'm assuming you did, but I was reading through your paper, Luke, and just thinking, we need this paper in ours. Like, it just intersects at so many points with our paper, it's always fun for a panel like this, I guess. And you set the panels up not knowing what papers what the papers are that you're going to get exactly, right. But it works out in this case, so I'm happy. One of the things that I was fascinated by, and I really am hoping that in a future version of the paper you expand on this, and I think you've mentioned that this is what you're going to expand on. There are maybe a couple things that overlap. The one is this, just the mediating power of these tools. So this is something that comes up obviously in the context of what we're talking about in sentiment analysis. But I really wanted to see more, maybe just by way of example or like a little bit of storytelling in the paper to really drive the point home. Like, who is it that you're talking about? Give us an example of how this really, like how these tools mediate the norms around, like the kind of normative judgments around emotion that we make in society when we see these kind of things reified in these tools, right? Or at least, so like if a tool is telling you, like, here's the emotion that we're detecting, we're using all these scientific cues to do it, that have been validated and all that. Like there are numbers and statistics and quantification. There's quantification all over the place here that drives the normative power of these tools, right? Once they get into people's hands. I wanted a little bit more about that storytelling. And one of the things that I found really interesting that you touched on in one paragraph, I think it was on the second last page, was when you started talking about the different ways that in critical theory, we're understanding the different ways that emotions serve as displays of like membership in a particular group. So it's like we will interpret an emotional response differently coming from one cultural or sort of in-group, out-group background than another. So we're going to just think that means something totally different than what it means in context in that particular cultural social group. And I wanted to hear a lot more about that because I think it's something that is only just coming to light in the humanities and social sciences that I think really needs to be accelerated. And I, certainly I think there are some authors doing this, but I think we all need to, like, those of us broadly who are working in the space, I think you touch on that point, and I really wanted to see that, it kind of amplified in your paper. And for sure, I mean, when Emily and I have a talk about kind of how to proceed on this paper, I think that's going to come up as a case study or an example that we use just to kind of drive a different kind of point home, because it's not just about misinterpreting, or I don't know. I don't know how to say it. I guess I'll leave it at there. I think that's what I wanted to say. Just a little bit more on that. So, but I really appreciated the fact that you raised that point, and I just wanted to hear more about it.
Yeah. No, thank you. No, I think that's right, and I think it's probably a failure on my part in terms of, and maybe a more general comment on the kind of North Atlantic focus of a lot of AI ethics work, where, it's not the first thing we, academics in North America think about is kind of the broader cultural context of emotion around the world. It's certainly things that people in postcolonial theory and other similar disciplines think about plenty. And there is some interesting work and some good work on this that I think is in the North American Academy starting out. Shazeda Ahmad at Berkeley is doing work on social credit in China, but also on emotion recognition in China, and the kind of just in the way you're talking about these kind of questions of culturally specific emotional cues and how that shapes the system. So I agree with that. The broader point about I had a good answer for the last question. Oh, about examples and storytelling. Yeah, I mean, like the two of you, and I'd love to hear maybe from you and from Emily about how the more about the kind of mechanics of sentiment analysis and hiring, right? I mean, hiring is one of the places where this kind of broader set of emotional sentiment analysis tools seem to be cropping up, to the point where you have, you know, stories in the press about coaches in different cultural contexts. So there was one about Korea and automated hiring in Korea, I think in the New York Times a few weeks ago. You know, people coaching job applicants how to control their affect to get a higher score on these systems. Notwithstanding that we don't really have a very good sense of how much these systems are using things like facial affect or voice tone or similar kind of mechanisms. Versus the sense that I think they are using sentiment analysis an awful lot in the answers that they're asking, you know, now analyzing the answers from applicants. Another space where I think is really ripe for kind of creative horrible style, you know, examples is education, right? Educational analysis, especially given the kind of huge interest in online track learning because of the pandemic, and that's something that Ben Williamson has written a bit about. But I think you know is a space where we can see it. I think, you know, it's interesting. I mean, if you know, these are all kind of like the kind of Foucauldian traditional sides of discipline, right? Like, I mean, it'd be really interesting to think about this in the military context and how the army is considering, not just for like using to control crowd populations, you know, in areas of interest and like analyzing populations, which we know they're doing, but how they're using these systems to kind of measure and control their own like people in the army, you know, soldiers. I think that'd be interesting to think about it. So yeah, if there's a Foucauldian disciplinary, you know, institution, you know, you might bet that they're beginning to move to some of these analytics. But I would love to hear more about the hiring and sentiment analysis, the kind of granular details from you guys.
So by way of I don't know, postscript, the issue on the army. So recently the project that we worked on, in which this is why I was asking about predictive theories of behavior, in which there was a question of can you like the meta question, the priming question was, so based on social media behavior, can you predict who will be a radical? And so there was a question of what does online language you say about internal states? What are the predictive models of that? And is that something you can actually build models around? Our answer was largely no, but still it's an interesting, the fact that people ask types of questions suggests that other people are probably doing something like this. Yeah,
there. Desmond Patton, who's at Columbia, has a whole lab dedicated to thinking about how tweets from inner city communities, especially in Chicago, can track and potentially predict gun violence, which I think is in a similar kind of space of what you're talking about, and I think which has maybe some similar concerns around whether not just whether it actually works, but how, and I think this is my broader concern across a lot of these models, how the model itself, you know, begins to reify the ideas about the people involved in the model to policymakers and even possibly to the people themselves. And I think there's a really interesting, you know, set of STS literature on this kind of performativity of models, and when they're applied to emotion, it's a big challenge. I think actually going back to Emily's point about the DSM-4 and 5, you see this with psychologists. Psychologists, you know, apparently sort of say, oh yeah, well, how do you tell this person has depression? Oh well, they have all the symptoms of the DSM-5, which is on the one hand maybe close enough, but on the other hand, it doesn't actually say anything with depression. So it's an interesting problem.
There's also an interesting angle. I'm curious. I don't know if I think your Ekman's theory, as you discussed, suggests that the signals are not falsifiable. There's a curious angle here where emotions can be adaptive and learned. So if you're refining and somebody wants to change the paradigm, they could change the expressions of emotion to confound existing models. And so I'm imagining some type of arms race between developers of models and people who are subject to the use of models. And I'm wondering if there is a flaw for that race, as in you can't modify your emotions beyond a certain level. I guess that would require a lot of really strong theories about emotions. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's the great appeal of basic emotion theory, is that it makes this claim that, no matter how hard you hide, you won't be able to, at some level, falsify this truth about what you're feeling, and that the truth about what you're feeling has normative weight. I think that's the point to draw out even more in the paper, which I think is just not true. I mean, Ruth Lays, who's a historian of psychology, has written a pretty definitive book taking down the science behind Ekman's theories. I mean, she's gone back and looked at his experiments in the 70s. She's critiqued the kind of conclusions that he draws from some of the cross-cultural work, especially between American and Japanese subjects in his tests. But I think I think this is part and parcel of a broader interest on the part of certainly of neuroscience and as associated with computer science, to kind of just push further into the body, right? Like so maybe we can't, maybe facial expressions don't do it, but if we could just get a brain signal showing where in the brain someone was lying from, quote unquote, if with the idea that there is a single signal in the brain that indicates lying, whatever that means, then we would know. And I think that I do think that that's misguided. I'm not sure that I think it is an open question as to the kind of the typicality of human emotions and how those work. You can certainly generally say that if somebody is smiling, they're probably more likely to be happy than if they're frowning. But again, right? You kind of it's maybe not. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a goose chase that is appealing because it conforms to what the technology can do, as opposed to what we know about the complexity of emotion.
All right. Final comments, final thoughts? Anybody?
No.
Oh, just one really quickly. To Emily and Jason, I would love to talk to you both about this competition thing. I'm really happy to meet other people who are interested in ML competitions, because this is one thing working in an AI lab you really notice, is how much of the conversation about research production centers around both entering competitions and developing your own competitions to be a kind of locus, right? For other people to develop models and raise your profile. So even apart from the specifics of competitions around sentiment analysis, just the whole, and I think it really ties to the fact that so much ML, at least so I'm a mild plug from my former employer, Microsoft Research in Montreal, right? This is a lab that has a very strong reinforcement learning team that does reinforcement learning for things like Miss Pac-Man, right? So getting these reinforcement learning agents to successfully beat very challenging 80s video games. So there seems to be some resonance between the video game as a test object and the competition as an object of the production of knowledge, which I think is super interesting. Anyway, so that's just an aside, but I think there's a really fruitful set of questions that come out of that.
There's probably a great paper in there somewhere as well about the difference between the pride and accomplishment that one feels when I don't know, when you beat the last level of Donkey Kong versus watching some AI do it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, but for sure the competition. I mean, the competitions, like you say, they seem to have become an incentive, like a whole set of incentives, like an incentive package in the academic world and in the AI world, that deserve to be picked apart and just to understand. And again, in the paper, we emphasize that there's clearly a role for these competitions. I mean, they're set up in a way to provide what I would think in one context is a very legitimate and important scale of measurement. But what's interesting is when you shift out of that context and use the same numbers to describe other things or to reinforce the power or value inherent in some model, then I think things start getting interesting.
Yeah.
Perfect. On that note, I think we're like arriving at the end of the time. So thank you so much on behalf of the We Robot 2020 Program Committee, so Oshande, Emily, Jason, and Luke for that amazing conversation, and to the authors for like those amazing papers. And thank you for everybody who has been watching online the video. Yeah. Thank you. Have a lovely reminding of the day. Bye-bye.